Hello, and welcome to Stories from India, a podcast where we talk about myths, legends, and folk tales from India. I am your host, Narad Muni, and I'm a mythological character myself. I have the gift of eternal life and knowledge of the past, the present, and the future. By profession, I'm a traveling musician and a storyteller. So, the way I'm doing my job is by podcast. In this episode, we are finally going to start on a series that I've waited to start for a while. It's the Singhasan Battisi. This is a series of 32 stories, all featuring a throne. And that's literally what Singhasan Battisi means. Today, we'll start by introducing the framing narrative of the story. The stories themselves we'll cover gradually in future episodes. The chief character today, besides the throne itself, is Raja Bhoj. Raja was not his first name. Raja is the Hindi word for king. Now, you probably want to know what kind of a king Bhoj was. Where did he fit on our king scale? The answer is that so far he had been a very middle of the road or 50th percentile king. He had not been evil enough to abandon his child in a dark forest or to unleash a deadly scorpion on his brother. But on the negative side, he hadn't done anything to earn much of a reputation. And that was also because he hadn't abandoned a child or murdered a sibling. He had never made page 3, the gossip page. He was a mediocre king at this stage of his rule. That was going to change. The catalyst for that came from the legacy of an older and wiser king who did make page 3 regularly. That older and wiser king did in fact relieve his brother of the potential stress of managing a kingdom by killing him with the scorpion that I mentioned earlier. He was King Vikramaditya. Now, Bhoj's story is several centuries after Vikramaditya's. Vikramaditya is well known for the Vikram and Betal stories, several of which we have covered before. But Vikram was quite the legend even without the association of the Betal. He was known for his wisdom and bravery. Bhoj would have liked to be a great king himself, just like Vikram had been. Little did he know that he was soon going to have that opportunity. It happened one day as he was taking a walk in his kingdom. It was a good pastime for a king to connect with his subjects. So Bhoj would pick a different section of his kingdom and take a stroll there, with his usual followers of ministers, soldiers, water boys, tourist guides, cartographers, and a bunch of other people. They passed by a farm they had not crossed before, but the farmer there was known to have a bit of a reputation. He was a cantankerous guy who would easily get annoyed at the slightest of things. To take an example, the other day he had beaten his cow for giving him 3 buckets of milk instead of 2. He had shouted at his shoe shine boy for polishing the left shoe before the right one. And he had sent an angry letter to Bhoj, whom he considered personally responsible for the lightning strike that hit an old oak tree in his yard. The king's visits were usually surprise visits, so the farmer had no idea they were coming. The king and his companions saw the farmer sitting on a little hill, a mound. Knowing this farmer's temper, they approached cautiously. But something seemed a little off. The farmer was a little too cheerful, an odd emotion for someone who was supposed to be such an unfriendly person. The king introduced himself, which strictly speaking was not necessary when your face is stamped on all the currency. But I think he did it strictly for the record. The farmer introduced himself as Krodhi, at which the king thought that the name certainly checked out, because Krodhi means angry. But this guy they were speaking to was not angry in the least. He welcomed the king heartily. "Welcome, Your Majesty. It's a pleasant day, isn't it? All of you are welcome. I must insist, you all must have lunch at my humble house. No, on second thoughts, you must have dinner too, tonight." While saying this, Krodhi was descending from his perch. But the moment he was off of the hill, Krodhi suddenly changed his tune. "Rogues! Trespassers! What are you doing here? How dare you enter my field? Begone, you rascals!" An official in the king's team, who tended to give people the benefit of doubt, tried to mediate things here. Maybe Krodhi had some kind of short-term memory loss. "This is the king," the official said. But Krodhi was not changing his stance. "I don't care if he's the king. What has the king ever done for me? Why are you all standing on my land? You're upsetting the delicate ecological balance of my farm." Everyone was surprised by this, because just a minute ago, Krodhi had himself beckoned them all over. But the king realized that Krodhi was legally justified in saying what he just did. Krodhi could withdraw his consent any time he wanted. So yes, the king and his team needed to step away from Krodhi's farm. They began walking away, some officials grumbling about what a crazy person Krodhi was. As if in response, Krodhi did something even crazier at this point. He was back on his spot on the mound. He said gently, "Your Majesty, you're walking away from here. Please don't go. What about lunch and dinner? I promise I'll lay out the red carpet for you." The king's doctor, who was also in the crowd, quickly walked up to the king and whispered in his ear, "Paranoid schizophrenia, and we've got a live specimen. We'll need to commit him to my clinic for several years so I can study him." "He is possessed," whispered the priest. "We must do a yajna right here, on this spot. I'll get the fire started." If you're unaware what a yajna is, it's a prayer said around a fire. The prayer is said by a priest on your behalf, so that some god somewhere listens to you and grants you your wish. It's usually a sign that you're desperate. For example, when Dasharath did one in episode 7 in order to get the Ramayana started. But the king thought that Krodhi's responses were not the result of chronic mental illness, nor were they caused by demonic possession. His behavior was completely dependent on his exact geographic location. Bhoj was certain that the little mound that Krodhi was sitting on was responsible for his behavior. When the farmer was on it, his attitude was a complete U-turn compared to when he was not on it. The first thing to do was to get Krodhi out of the way. For his own good, of course. So, Bhoj had his guards arrest Krodhi. Krodhi quietly accepted it when the guards handcuffed him as he still sat on the mound. But he did put up a huge fight after he got off the mount. He found that he couldn't really fight against a dozen guards, especially when handcuffed. So, he resorted to calling them all names, which, for the sake of decency, I will choose not to repeat here. The king had some of his archaeologists work on the mount. Yep, he also had archaeologists in there. Now, Bhoj made a major assumption here that whatever was causing the change in Krodhi's behavior was not in the dirt itself, but underneath it. Events proved him right though, because when his archaeologists excavated the dirt, they found something. A particularly nerdy looking official exclaimed, "I know what that is. It is a flat seat with 4 perpendicular legs at each corner." "You mean it's a chair?" said another official. "No, it's a throne," said Bhoj. He recognized it by its distinctive cup holder, footrest, and a side clip to hang a crown. It made sense that he had been the one to identify it. After all, he had had first-hand experience with thrones and crowns. When they cleared all the dirt around it, a historian in the group gasped in surprise. Bhoj looked around and said, "Come on! This was already stretching it with doctors and priests and archaeologists. But seriously, a historian? Do I want people to go around thinking I can't do a simple thing on my own? Without a whole bunch of people accompanying me everywhere?" No one replied. No one wanted to own up. Least of all, the baker and the candlestick maker, who were both trying to make themselves invisible after the king's last remark. Finally, Bhoj realized that since the historian knew what he was talking about, might as well use his knowledge. At which point, the historian explained that the throne was that of King Vikramaditya. This time, it was the king's turn to gasp, at which all of the crowd gasped as well, though they weren't sure why. In fact, the gardener nudged the fisherman and asked him who Vikramaditya was. The fisherman replied that Vikramaditya was a powerful ruler from probably a couple of thousand years ago. "Still does not ring a bell," the gardener replied. "Narad refers to him as Vic," the fisherman answered. "He was featured in episode 110 a few months ago." "Oh, that guy, the one with the Betal." "Yes, indeed, the one with the Betal," the historian responded to the king's unspoken question. "Legend has it that the throne of Vikramaditya grants wisdom to whomever sits on it." "Is that how he answered all the Betal's questions?" the king asked. "No," the historian replied. "Vikram was with the Betal in the cemetery, and the throne must have been left behind in the palace. I don't see any attached wheels here. He couldn't possibly have dragged this around everywhere. Which makes total sense anyway, because the throne got those qualities from Vikram, not the other way around." "How do you know all this?" Bhoj asked. The historian held up a book he had been glancing through. "It's in here," he said. "It's the operating manual, which was in this secret compartment built into the throne itself." At which, Bhoj realized that he didn't know everything about thrones after all. He must go and check if his own throne had a secret compartment too. "What else was in there besides the manual?" Bhoj asked. A lottery ticket, some photos of Vikram. Oh, wait, these aren't photos, these are currency notes. There are also some post it notes and some chewing gum and a discount coupon to a big bazaar store somewhere in Ujjain. And there's a warranty card too, but it has expired. There's also a card that says, if found, please return to Vikramaditya. It's 2 or 3 millennia too late, Bhoj replied. Oh well, finders keepers. So it's mine now. At that point, Krodhi tried to object, but he was completely ignored. Later, he was given Vikramaditya chewing gum and discount coupon though. Those were considered adequate compensation. Bhoj ordered that the throne be cleaned and sanitized and brought to the palace. He loved his own throne, but it was time for a change. He had meant to get his throne serviced. It probably needed an oil change, and the reclining feature was not working 100% of the time. Bhoj would sit on Vikramaditya's throne and then decide which one he liked better. Now, when you have almost your entire kingdom's GDP going towards your own treasury, it's totally fine to splurge. That's why, to make an adequate home for the throne, a new palace was constructed. The throne room in his palace was huge. The throne itself was perched up high, where it had a bird's eye view of the remote corners of the room. There were a number of steps leading up to the throne itself. Everything was decorated, and everything looked spectacular for the inauguration of this new throne room. There was an elaborate ribbon cutting ceremony. There were speeches, and even Krodhi was recognized. He was given a giant check because Bhoj's lawyers made him do it to avoid a future lawsuit. Krodhi was appeased, though he did complain all the way about how ridiculously oversized this check was. He didn't think his bank would cash a check this size. Considering that the amount on it was really small, the lawyers assured him that his bank would cash the check. Finally, after a late evening of celebrations, concerts, and stand-up comedy, most of which was live telecast, everyone was dead tired. But the party moved on to the main event. The moment Bhoj would ascend to the throne. He looked at his path to the throne. He had earlier wondered why there were so many steps. He was told that the craftspeople had done that to match the number of little idols on the throne itself. Strange that Bhoj had not even noticed the idols. But he began his ascent. The moment he placed his foot on the first step, something happened. There was a noise, and suddenly a figure swooped down from the throne towards Bhoj. "Bat!" screamed one courtier. The figure halted mid-flight and glared at the courtier who had shouted. And the king looked up. It looked like a lady, probably an Apsara. She was more beautiful than anyone the king had ever seen. She approached the king and asked, "Password?" I'm not sure," the king replied. "Wrong answer. You have 2 attempts left. Try again," the Apsara responded. "Look, I don't even know what the password is supposed to do, the king said. Wrong answer. That's not the password. You're down to your last attempt. Vikramaditya? Asked Bhoj, tentatively. Wrong again. You've exhausted all your attempts, the Apsara replied. But I must be allowed to try again. There has to be an override mechanism for this. If you mean you would like to reset your password, that is totally possible. Just answer some security questions, the Apsara said. Bhoj asked, What kind of questions are these? Like, what was my mother's maiden name, the street I grew up on, the license plate of my first chariot? They are situational questions, the Apsara replied. They will test your judgment, and you must answer them truthfully. I have an inbuilt lie detector, so you cannot fool me. Bhoj considered going past the Apsara, but the whole court was staring at him to see what he would do next. This was a matter of his image. The only way to make this work was to get the questions absolutely right. Or his subjects, and more importantly his historians, would never let anyone forget. He sighed and thought maybe it had been a bad idea to do a live telecast of this event to the whole kingdom. We'll leave it there, with Bhoj standing on the very first step and pressure mounting on him to get his answers to the Apsara's questions absolutely right. That's all for this episode. Some notes on the show. The throne was made by King Indra. He had gifted it to Vikramaditya. It did grant the king a lot of powers. But that was not how he solved the Betal's problems. Check out the links in the show notes to previous Vikram Betal episodes. In the next episode, we'll continue the story of the Ramayana. Now that Ram and Lakshman have met Hanuman, they will talk to Sugriv and continue their search for Sita. If you have comments or suggestions, or if there are particular stories that you would like to hear, please do let me know by leaving a comment or a review on the site sfipodcast.com or tweet at sfipodcast. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get notified automatically of new episodes. Thanks to all of you listeners for your continued support and your feedback. And I also wish you a very happy Diwali. The music is from purpleplanet.com. That's purple-planet.com. I'll see you next time.